Professor Rosi Braidotti is a pioneer in European women's studies. Originally from Italy to Australia via the Sorbonne to the Netherlands, Braidotti is currently Distinguished University Professor at Utrecht University and founding director of the Centre of the Humanities there. She has written extensively on feminism and nomadism, pushing to overcome hierarchy, binary opposition, and anthropocentrism. She was awarded a Dutch knighthood in 2005, which, if like me, you've been watching too much Games of Thrones, gives rise to these amazing associations. Her most recent book is The Posthuman, which examines the self-understanding, cultural representations, and social and political participations of subjects in our current global and technologically mediated societies. She also has an extensive knowledge of riot girl bands. Please welcome Rosi Braidotti.
Thank you, dear Natalie, for that very flattering introduction. I can't see anybody, but I want you to know, given that internet has no secrets, that you may all address me as Sir Rosi anytime you wish. It's a great honor to be here, an afternoon of reflection and celebration, and I really want to start by expressing my warmest thanks and deep admiration to the organizing team, led by Lisa Pacini and Gidsken Braadlie, sorry the pronunciation, Natalie, and so many others that I can't even name them. You all labored under really difficult circumstances, including a hotel strike, hardly any resources at all to bring us all here. Without your activist commitment, this just would never have happened. So please join me in thanking First Strike for Symposium. Thank you. My argument is very simple. I want to read the Pussy Riot collective project as political. Political in terms of social cultural activism, political in the light of a very distinguished pedigree of feminist politics. And I have two real arguments. One is visual, much longer. The second one is musical, much shorter, but it will get you dancing. So let's start with the visual part about what constitute the politicals. We live in a strange era, in a strange system, where in spite of massive counter-evidence in terms of injustices, ruthless opportunism, and brutal violence, the system calls itself advanced capitalism. Now, what's advanced about it is really a very good question. But in such an advanced, brutal system, the question of what constitutes our collective understanding of the political is really the burning question. While politics, as usual, continues to unfold its protocols of choreographed antagonism and predictable institutional blah, 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 new waves of political movements, new waves of feminist movements are operating through diffuse resistance to despotic regimes, the occupation of public spaces, and the quest for alternative modes of being subjects, I would argue, of being human. A worldwide new women's movement is definitely at work. You've seen it in the demonstrations across the world. And as a generation that actually calls itself now the second wavers, I watch these new developments with pride, with joy, and with a touch of concern in view of the violence of the repression that these new mobilizations are triggering. Feminist politics, for me, expresses the desire for transformations by taking as its starting point the embodied and embedded affective and relational structures of our subjectivity and our social relations. Embodied and embedded, affective and relational, starting from the closest, the most intimate, which is also the most political, opening up to broader issues. Violence, freedom, poverty, dignity, legality, radical democracies. This is what is at stake. But the starting point is the politics of locations, the politics of everyday life, where life is not to be taken for granted, but is approached as an ethical, political, and juridical praxis, as something to be worked on. This insight into the politics of the everyday translates into a sort of involvement with the present, a sort of intimacy with the world. Very often, feminists are dismissed for being just cultural movements. You girls don't know what the real political is. As if the real political was somewhat elsewhere, something to do with violence, something to do with storming palaces, something to do always at the end of the day with very aggressive antagonism. What about a political that actually activates new technologies of the self, new modes of ethical interactions, new way of defining, yes, the progressive emancipatory measures, but also new experiments with self-styling, with new modes of ethical interactions? What other politics do you need than the politics that starts changing the way we live, we love, we interact with each other? And so there is a criticism here of the universalistic orientation of most political theory, including Marxism. Feminism stressed the need to change for a change of scale in our critiques of power, to start from the body, from our own carnal, psychic, embodied existence, situated practices, and to start from there, local, here and now, is not a reduction. On the contrary, it's a way of rooting, of grounding, effective, pragmatic, to quote my favorite philosopher Deleuze, radically immanent practices, to come to terms with the present while resisting it, being oppositional without being negative. That is the challenge of radical politics today. Of course, there is intense awareness of the vulnerability of embodied subjects, and that leads to subtler and more effective analysis of how vulnerabilities are socially constructed and enacted. And I know Judith will talk a lot more about this. But this emphasis on fragility and vulnerability also goes hand in hand with resistance to despotic power, resistance to masculine violence, and the quest for alternative ways of going about it. Difference in the feminist tradition is never a neutral category. It comes together with patterns of exclusion and marginalization. To be different from in our culture so often means to be worth less than. How to enact difference affirmatively, positively, to make a difference that is not just dialectically related to the present by negation, but asserts vital alternatives. That is, for me, the strength of feminist politics. Yes, we are all human. Some are more mortal than others, but we are here and we do get organized. We do not just agonize. I want to stress this because at this particular point in our political history, there is a general tendency to dismiss or deride feminism. And there's a tendency to reduce it to this boring, I don't know how people get these images of feminism, as this kind of sex-hating, I don't know, where do you get it from? I'll show you some of the clips in a minute. This is a culture of joy and of insurrections. Feminism has always rejected the sanctimonious, dogmatic tone of all dominant ideologies, especially those on the left. Joyful acts of insurrections, gratuitous acts of disobedience is the way the feminist political genealogy has always developed. Counter-alternative that express a profound sort of form of generosity, a profound desire to launch experimentations that actually mobilize what we have of the most vital, creative, and risky, risk-taking side. Humble experiments and a key contribution to radical democracies. And this has always been a big dialogue, a conflictual dialogue between the feminist and the European left. But particularly the Marxist tradition of taking revolutionary violence for granted, as if that was really the political, and everything else, affect, sexuality, pacifism, human rights, was somewhat cultural, aesthetic, in the totally irrelevant sense of the term. While the theoretical gurus of what's left of the left complain about their political impotence, to cite Alain Badiou, or perfect the histrionic art of debunking, like Zizek, they also accomplish a far more pernicious sleight of hand. They have virtually erased the intellectual and political capital built by feminist theory and practice over the last 30 years. It's as if we had developed no alternative schemes, no methods, no practices and tactics that could be of general relevance. The left has questions to answer about the epistemic violence they have exercised against feminism, and they should then not add insult to injury by first deleting feminist politics and then complaining that there is no alternative politics left on the left. What's left of the left misunderstands the feminist politics of experience. They fail to see the relevance of the politics of desire and of affirmation. Feminism expresses a radical aspiration to freedom, aimed to confront and demolish the established institutionalized form of both politics and identities. Is the joyful affirmation of counter-subjectivities, which, far from being a regression into cultural narcissism, as the likes of Zizek are known to believe, it is an incisive intervention on the brutality and the banality of power. It encourages the joint efforts of critique and creativity to pursue political aims of well-being, of being at home in the world, of having our respect and dignity recognized in the world for collective practices and not for individual profit reasons. It is really a total gesture of love for the world, to quote not my favorite philosopher, Hannah Arendt, geared to the I do this for Judith, geared to the task of constructing social horizons of hope. So this is my general argument. We can stop here and start a discussion, but I want to give you a number of examples of how it works. And the first set of examples is to do with the visual politics of this advanced system, which is advanced in a very ironical sense of the term. Capitalism is actually a very primitive system, and this is why some conservatives take pride in defining capitalism as instinctive and inbuilt in our genetic capital. I would reject any such flattering the definitions of the inevitability of capitalism. And actually, I think my political culture, feminism, critical theory, we have debunked any notion of the natural roots of power. I would even say that molecular grassroots movements like feminism have subjected the micropolitics of domination to intense analysis. We don't think capital is transcendent. I don't think it's genetically transmitted. It is radically immanent to forceful practices of inscriptions of bodies into relations of power. And one of the crucial ways in which capitalism achieves this is by visualizing power. It's the powers of visualization that are so crucial to the political economy of consciousness in so-called advanced capitalism. Feminists have been very quick to reveal the seduction of the images of power in the dominant system, and the way in which a public image, in my particular case, public faces, embody power. Deleuze calls this the function of regimes of faces as a way of organizing power. Faciality, horrible term, but philosophy is full of horrible things. Faces as way of colonizing the self, creating a private property of a bounded individual, recognizable, identifiable, consumable. A face distributes power across a territory. It creates it and controls it. It engenders the self as a brand. It engenders the nation as a territory. It naturalizes them. Faces. And I know that right now, as my slides are going to begin, you're all going to think that I'm going to project as a starter, as an example of the faces of power, the faces of the likes of Silvio Berlusconi and Vladimir Putin. But that is just not going to happen. Not only because those faces are repulsive, but because I want to make the point about how this kind of power works. It's a little bit too easy to take the despotic faces. I want to take the face of power closer to home. If a face is a way of organizing the territory, if public faces are in the ways of indexing power, then let's start with what is familiar. I'm a feminist. With what is close to home, with what is situated. Think of the healing power of the presence of King Harald at the horrendous events around the killing on the islands of Utøya and here in Oslo in 2011, when the lives of so many young people were taken. It was the time when Norway taught the world a lesson with your dignity, with your grief, and we all did mourn with you. But the king was there, the face was there. So as the first slide goes up, let's start from the benevolent face of power, drawn from the Northern European constitutional monarchies, countries like Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, great democracy, often run by women. And I am a great admirer of the former Queen of the Netherlands. She did an amazing job, professional, caring, but she always took care of business. The political economy of faces actually codifies power, distributes it, organizes, allocates it a place. Possessing the right face is a social process of becoming subject, and it functions by binary exclusion. Is she black or white? Is she straight or LGBT? Is she subjected or the subject of? The face will tell. Following Canguilhem and Deleuze's definition of normality as the 0 degree of deviancy, I would encourage you to see the production of faces, white, powerful, self-entitled femininity, as the site of contradictory workings of power. Yes, there is privilege, there is normativity, but there is also functionality. There is also commodification. The function of dominant faces is always phallic, no matter what the gender is of the person who actually exercises. Its task is to convey the norm and to get the job done. In the case of heads of state, the functionality of faces is shown by their historical reproduction in coins and stamps, where the standard of recognizability is immediate. This is the face that marks a territory, that marks a mode of belonging. The French, who have much more taste for their aesthetics than anybody else on earth, regularly change the faces on their coins and stamps, making it an honor for the chosen woman to represent the Republic. In 2013, incidentally, Ina Shevchenko, founder of the Ukrainian movement Femen, became the face of Mariana, the French Republic for all French stamps. Please, girls, if this happens to you, don't do it. In democracies, however, the faces of our rulers and leaders are also normally used for ironical, satirical, and culture jamming purposes. Democratic criticism requires the use of satire and irony as means to speak truth to power, as Edward Said put it so passionately and so correctly. And this is certainly the case in the Dutch cultural political tradition, where actually playing with the faces of the rulers is part of the standard practices of democracy. Here we have the famous Andy Warhol series on queens, many other, I think the Danish queen was in there, Lizzie was there as well. And the next one we have from the United Color, next slide, United Colors of Benetton, the Toscani era, the impossibility of turning a white ruler into a brown woman, quite extraordinary. So the political function of faces enters a new phase of intensity when these faces become hyper-mediated. Visualization today is the ultimate form of success, control, and commodification. The omnipotence of digital media and social network is there to stay. It is also internally contradictory. It commodifies everybody, but it also intensifies the difference in accessing the very technologies that actually accomplish the commodification. Digitally relayed faces produce both circulation and immobility. There is something about commodification that sort of hangs there. It is an overaccumulation of visual objects of consumption. They both capture desire and suspend it. They never quite fulfill you. It's the eternal deferment of pleasure, which is the key to the addictive power of commodified pictures, commodified objects. We keep coming back to more. We are all addicted to our selfies and to other objects of visual consumption. Tomorrow, this very event will enter the static regime of circulation as a never dead object of desire, but being posted online where everybody can watch us and check out how we are doing. It's a spectral economy of never being alive, of never being quite dead, circulated endlessly in mediated suspension. And I think that this means that the visual commodity, the recognizable visual commodity, becomes very much part of our consciousness, of the time of our lives, and the times of our social relations. In a never-ending cycles of presence and absence, give me another shot, can I get some more? Hanging in there, people call it also the pornography of representation. But it is in any case a perverse, addictive political economy. So then, icons enter the discussion. The commodified face as a landscape of power stresses the role of the social imaginary as the unconscious interpellation that constitute our social structure, our social field. Imaginary representation fulfill both a psychic and a social function, and sort of united us in power of identification and in collectively shared powers of frustration, because the commodity never fully fulfills. In the past, the icons were religious in origin and function. Today, and the next slide shows that they are dominated by the celebrities of popular culture, ranging from the ubiquitous faces, Che Guevara, young Angela Davis, Nelson Mandela, or one of my favorite, the White Angels, Princess Diana. She's up there in Mars with Elvis Presley. She never died in Paris. It's not true. These iconic representations fulfill a totemic function in the religious sense of the term. They suffered so that we may all be better off. And these irrational or mystical elements of the faces of popular culture is precisely what a lot of commentators are very negative about. In the irrational, mystical elements of faciality, of recognizable faces, was an argument played against the Pussy Riot in the court cases, that these are irrational forms of mass popular culture. But they have also worried great critical theories like Adorno and Deleuze, who do worry about the mystical attraction of certain faces, their manipulative power, a power which is, of course, multiplied by contemporary digital culture. These become the sacred monsters of global visual consumptions. Mediated faces are really material practices of power. Feminist criticism is one of the conceptual detox cures to help us rid ourselves of our attachment to certain forms of dominant faces, to the appeal of certain icons. There is a sort of a positive and a creative tension between the identitarian claims, the modes of identification that we can have with certain faces, and the resistance to their territorializing power, another horrible term, to their power to sort of manipulate and control our psychic self-representations. There is a tension between recognizable faces and anonymous masses, a tension between icons that fix you and movements that liberate you, lines of flight that set you moving. Tension between the high visibility and the potential despotism of the one and the facelessness of the multitude. How to achieve visibility while escaping reterritorialization in the age of hypermediation is the critical question. In identifying the points of exits from this dominant sort of images, we need as much creativity as critique, and this is where the work of arts and culture is so fundamental. To break open the binary between the recognizable one and the nameless many, feminism has invented and invested into the potency of anyone, the transversal collectivity of anybodiness. Deleuze, always good to quote my favorite teacher, speaks of homo tantum, the anybody who becomes the site of resistance, the becoming political. Feminists, as usual, cut to the chase. We just put on different faces. And if you remember the Guerrilla Girls, feminist politics, like all bio-mediated political interventions, juxtaposes the recognizable faces of icons to anonymous, unexpected, unpredicted faces in order to open up public spaces for anyone to become political. That's causing great turmoil, great surprise. The radical politics stance today consists in becoming minoritarian, and the Pussy Riot put it very elegantly. You put on your mask, you become Pussy Riot. You take it off, you stop being Pussy Riot. I don't know how many of you brought balaclava today, but do feel free to put them on. Just take them off when your makeup starts to melt. It's embarrassing. The process of becoming Pussy Riot is subversive in that it works actively towards the transformations of the science, the social practices, the embodied history of institutionalized identity. Quests for identity are expanded to become the base for broader claims, away from the fixity of face-bound identities. No identity, not even LGBTs, is an exception to the rule of commodification and reterritorialization. So the best that we can do is sort of place our identity claims strategically and keep them moving. That's the becoming political. The masked faces of Pussy Riot, who are both overexposed celebrities and anonymous militants, carrying on what must feel at times like a losing battle, sustained under the threat of constant retaliation, repression, and violence. You put on that mask and you're carrying on. And in putting on the balaclava, you don't hide yourself, but rather express another political subjectivity that allows you to unveil and debunk the workings of power and despotism. A despotic power that will tear away that mask from you, give you back a face, give you a social location, and proceed to prosecute you and chuck you in jail for it. Subjectification as subjection. In the case of Vladimir Putin, his visual illiteracy made him underestimate the extent to which the exposed faces of the previously nameless Pussy Riot protesters would turn Nadia and Maria into global icons and megastars. Pussy Riot becomes a meteorite. And I don't think there's anybody in the world today who does not wish to be them, be like them. My students order me to bring back 500 photos, please, or they will never finish my course. This is a struggle not only against the despotic image of power, but also a struggle for alternatives, to reveal and unveil, not to conceal and disguise. A struggle you fight at your own risk and peril, without guarantees of success, relentless, subterranean, fundamentally invisible, even when it is televised and webcast. Deeply democratic in a Spinozist mode, feminist politics expresses the aspiration to freedom as constitutive of the human subject. This is viral politics at work, and it does go viral. As a political gesture, it is also deeply radical in holding so-called advanced democracies accountable for our limitations, contradictions, and hypocrisy. Radical politics shows that all democracy is work in progress, and advanced democracies need to become democratic as well. It all begins with the body in the framing of spatial and temporal scales that will enable us to redefine what happens in our dealings with each other right here, right now. Becoming democratic means becoming a people that was missing, bringing about a time that will have been sustainable, never forgetting the future, the politics of any faces, all faces of a resisting people to come, rejecting the power of that one. And there's more riot. There's more riot. That's the heavy stuff. Do I still have a few minutes? Because I have the music part, which is fun. Second example then, so there is this pedigree in my reading of the Pussy Riot phenomenon. There is also another pedigree, which is, as Natalie said, is very dear to my heart. And it is the feminist cultural politic of music, of protest bands. When Pussy Riot sang Mother of God, Please Chase Putin Out, they were simply joining in our long, long tradition of singers who did the same. The original member of the Club of 27, Janis Joplin, as early as 1969, addressed an appeal to the good Lord to please help her out. Let's hear Janis. So much like a baby boomer to want nothing but commodities. The appeal to the good Lord here is not blasphemy, it's a technical or ironical device, and not unlike what we've just seen done to Queen Beatrix. It is a way of appealing to higher powers, given that the temporal ones are so hopeless. So this consumeristic mode, typical of the baby boomers, will be replaced in due course by the deconstruction of the market economy and gender identity, but the purest of revolution, the punk rockers of the early 1980s, and I wish I could have 6 hours and show you them all. I just want to say that Cyndi Lauper was there before Madonna and 100 times better. Thank you. Few movements in popular culture can match the punks in iconoclastic rejection of stereotypes, uncompromising criticism, and political determination. The punk movement debunked the perverse political economy of advanced capitalism by targeting its consumerism. And of course, they became a commodity themselves, but it's inevitable. Capitalism promotes the quantitative proliferations of multiple options in consumers' goods, 50 television stations and nothing decent to watch. It's a spinning machine that produces quantified variations of commodities. It functions through the social control of mobility, in a perverse control of mobility, favoring the circulation of commodified products, goods, data, and capital. People don't circulate nearly as freely. Real-life mobility through migration, for instance, is highly controlled and checked by relations of class, ethnicity, gender, and age, to name but a few variables. So I think that with the punk movement, we get to the core of the critique of the political economy of advanced capitalism. The punk movement is chronologically simultaneous with post-structuralism, and I really think that they echo each other. I have my favorites, and I'm a European, so the example I'm going to play you is the one and only, a dissident from Berlin, tremendous, Nina Hagen. You would want more? No. The real turning point, it's in all the history books, it's in every anthology of feminist theory, is Kathleen Hanna and the Bikini Kill. There's no way to be we have just to drop on your knees and listen. A personal favorite again, in view of the time, I have to go quickly. Double dare, yeah, let's hear them. Breaks my heart, but we have to go on. From Olympe de Gouges' Universal Declaration of the Rights of Women to the lyrics of punk rockers down to Pussy Riot, feminists have expressed their resistance in and through their bodies, misbehaving in public places so as to undo the restrictions of repressive powers. We've written our protest in letters of ink, fire, and at times even blood, on paper, on stone walls, on sand. We have sung and danced to them. This kind of protest is like a visceral scream of rebellion against the centralized master code of sovereign power. It's a generous act of intervention upon our common world. So what do the Pussy Riot know? What do they teach me, at least? First, that you can only beat the system from within, and it's going to hurt. For all the talk about virtual reality, soft diplomacy, digital networks, the materiality of power weighs heavily upon our embodied and embedded subject. The virtual character of technologically mediated power relations is material, ruthless, absolutely materially grounded. Power harps on real bodies in real life situations with a degree of targeted violence that for me is necropolitical, even more than biopolitical. Pussy Riot know that women and LGBTs are especially targeted, and resistance starts but does not stop there. They force attention onto issues of radical democracy as well as identity politics, moving towards broader political issues of poverty, social justice, peace, environmental sustainability, and many, many more. They cultivate a healthy disregard for the distinctions between high and low culture, with special emphasis on the political power of creativity and artistic expressions. They know, and from the Occupy movement to the early dances actually in the French Revolution, the cultural elements of any social transformative movements are incredibly important. Pussy Riot know that technological mediation, artistic and cultural practice are forms of social participation, key elements of contemporary global citizenship, even and especially when they involve civil disobedience. They know that culture is a political arena as well as a global vector of transnational communication, identification, and generational recognition. They also know at an exceedingly high personal cost that the freedom of expression, especially of political dissent, is still not a universally accepted human and political right, even on the European continent. As feminist activists and active citizens, the Pussy Riot combined the struggle for emancipation of youth, women, and minority with a visceral democratic impulse. The technologically mediated power of expression gives them a global outreach. They are, in my terms, nomadic subjects, but they remain loyal to their own vision of the norms and values of their specific country. They're situated, and they're Europeans dear to my heart. They express a new transnational political subjectivity that clashes with the unitary formations of church, nation, and state, and they are simultaneously global netizens and locally rooted active citizens in a community that fails to grant them basic rights. This produces serious political and cultural critique through visual and musical interventions. It deserves to be taken seriously, and not only by Putin and the fathers of the church who sent them to jail for it, but as a model of radical politics in our mediated times, also for what is left of the left. Their politics is all the more effective as it is joyful, affirmative. It puts wings on your feet, even as they lie behind bars. Pussy Riot's creative acts of insurrection prove conclusively what my teacher Deleuze much more pompously said: you don't have to be sad in order to be militant, even though the thing that you're fighting is abominable. Affirmation, not sadness, fuels our politics. Anarchist feminist Emma Goldman already had anticipated this decade ago when she stated famously, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." Occupying the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow was, in an indirect way, an act of deviancy aimed at attacking the despotic means by which Vladimir Putin has organized his face, his territory, his power, with the support of the Orthodox fathers of the Church. But it was first and foremost an affirmative event, done out of love, in which a short and sudden outburst of raw energy revealed the impotence of power forever. It was a prayer of joy, a hymn to freedom. And this is why we love them, and this is why we're here today. Pussy Riot.
Черные рясы, золотые погоны, все прихожане ползут на поклоны, призрак свободы на небесах. И правда отправит Сибирь готова! Глубоко глубее, склоны седой, ведет протестующих снова конвой.